Hi, it's Rachel from Elevated Elephant podcast, and today we have a real special treat as we are joined by the lovely Anastasia or Tass Cambitzi. And me and Tass have worked together a few times. We ran a couple of retreats and I've been to many of her classes and vice versa. And today we're talking about YIN yoga. And I've had to put it into two parts because we were talking so much and we kind of got diverted along the way. So rather than it just being only about what makes yin yin, it sort of turned into a more of a philosophical discussion as well about, the massive umbrella of yoga, which I think is super interesting, and it's a rabbit hole that I love getting thrown into. So get yourself a cup of tea, sit back and enjoy listening to the wisdom of this beautiful yogini. So here it is. Okay. Hello, Tass.
Hi, Rachel.
So if you could give our viewers who might not have, or viewers, our listeners who might not have heard of you, little brief intro into what got you into yoga. Just a small question to start off with.
Oh, that wasn't on the list of questions that you asked me.
Ha ha ha, cheeky.
What got me into yoga? So I came from a background that was much more focused on meditation and mindfulness, and that was through recovering from aspects of trauma, both physically and mentally. And that was one of the techniques that was used to help people be able to sit with themselves for longer periods of time, in order to stay with thoughts rather than just kind of running away from them mentally. And I never did any kind of movement practice. I had never been to a gym. In fact, even as a child, I didn't participate in sports. I was at a boarding school where sports were, kind of required of everybody. And I somehow managed to dodge years and years of having to play lacrosse and netball and running track and all that kind of thing. And so by the time I actually reached a yoga mat, which was, in my 20s, I was actually terrified of physical sensation. Mm-hmm. But I'd had this teaching or practice or guidance, whatever you want to call it, or background of meditation and mindfulness. And that enabled me to start to move my body and to start to focus on bits that weren't uncomfortable, like, just weight in the sole of my foot rather than the strength of a stretch or whatever it might be. And bit by bit, my nervous system got used to being in my body. And before I knew it, I was able to participate in quite dynamic forms of yoga. Sometimes pushing myself further than my nervous system wanted to go, and then I would reel it back a little bit, and then I would push out again, and then I would reel it back. And that's really been my sort of journey with yoga. It's basically been a practice for my nervous system, and it's strengthened and made me a much less reactive person, I would say.
Do you know, I think a lot of people probably would be able to relate to that relationship with their body, and actually yoga as a method to sink back in and have good thoughts about their body. I mean, I wasn't sporty at all either, but I had dance as an outlet. So I feel like I think I would have been similar to a point that I may have had more negative connotations when it comes to, I'm not flexible, or I'm not graceful, or I can't do this, my body lets me down. And then I think a lot of people find that they're actually quite good at yoga. I know, good with those little air quotes. And I think as well, it's a non-competitive thing as well. I mean, it can be, depending on your state of mind. Because it is ideally non-competitive, I think it allows people as well to experiment in their own space. They don't have
Yeah.
they don't have to partner up with people. They don't have to join
I
a
love
sports
the boundary
team. They
that
can
is
be
my favourite boundary of all time.
the yoga mat.
That sort of 3 feet by 6 foot or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and nobody comes into it. You know,
Yeah.
maybe the teacher comes over, but there's a definite invitation. There's nothing quite like that in the world of movement, where it's completely an exploration. I don't think.
It's like a safe space, I think, for people.
Yeah.
And it was for me as well, and I think it sounds like for you as well. But really, while we're here, I just wanted to go and give a brief intro, because it's fascinating. But really, we're here to talk about yin yoga, because I am pretty ignorant about yin yoga. I've dabbled a bit. Hey? Maybe I just don't know. Maybe I'm doing it sometimes and I just don't know. I don't know. But how would you describe yin yoga in your words?
Well, we can get very in depth here, but I'll try and keep it fairly simple. I would not describe yin yoga as a certain type of practice. I mean, for constructs of timetables and schedules and things, we have to kind of label things with capital letters, yin yoga. But yin describes a quality, and anything can be yin in relation to something else. So it doesn't necessarily, you immediately see on a timetable yin yoga, that means it's going to start like this. It's going to have poses that are held for a long time. We're going to talk a lot about connective tissue, and then we're going to finish with a pentacle rather than a shavasana. And that might be the format that a lot of classes follow, because you've got an hour and a half to deliver a class, and sometimes it's just not possible to get into the minutiae of the meaning of things like yin and yang. So yin describes a quality. It means the softer, deeper, more sensual side of anything, really. And we talk about things being yin in terms of location. So, for instance, the heart is yin to the breastbone because it's deeper within the body. We talk about things being yin in terms of kind of adverbs of being deeper, more within, softer, I guess you could say more feminine, but I'm trying to stay away from that, because often we talk in yoga about the masculine and feminine energies, which, and again, that sometimes translates into sun and moon, which, as we know, is a misconception about the word hatha, which neither of hat nor tat means moon or sun in Sanskrit. And it was a sort of misunderstanding of the hatha yoga pradipika. It describes a quality.
Doesn't hatha, I was just thinking about hatha. Does it not mean force? Some sort of force?
Yes, it means effort.
Yeah.
And yin doesn't mean effortless. It's not necessarily, when we go into a yin practice, we're told to soften our muscles because it's the opposite of yang. And that allows us to access connective tissue. But it doesn't the yin practice is a very challenging practice. It takes great effort and great drawing back of the mind to one-pointed focus, or meditation, whatever you're attempting to meditate the mind onto. So it certainly falls into the hatha yoga practice of force or effort, of discipline. And it comes from the Tao, which is a Chinese philosophy. I mean, you know much more about the Hatha Yoga lineage, but Hatha Yoga, the Pradipika, is often attributed to around the 15th century.
Yeah.
But some go back further than that, to kind of the 6th century. But the Tao was 5th, 6th century, written by a Chinese philosopher called Lao Tzu. But very, very similar concepts to the Hatha Yoga practice. And lots of experts consider Yin Yoga as one of the oldest Hatha Yoga practices.
That is awesome. And reading, actually, I think Tantra, I was talking to Tass before we started the interview, but Tantra, I think, is one of the older roots of Hatha. And it's really interesting that you say that Yin yoga, or the form of Yin yoga, is one of the oldest forms of hatha in like different locations.
Yeah.
And also, I also got thinking about when you said about force and effort. Whenever I've participated in one of your Yin classes, it can be really heating.
Yeah.
Like it's a different kind of heat than maybe muscular efforting, like you do in a dynamic asana class. But I found it heating in a very it's a internal. Sometimes it's mind heat that creates heat in the body.
Yeah. Well, the Tao is a very interesting text. The Tao Te Ching is a very interesting text because it's incredibly different to what we have in the West at the moment, which is, buy this recipe book, eat this way, and you'll get this, or do this form of exercise. If you want hypertrophy of muscles, you do this many reps.
Very
if you
formulaic
want lean muscles, you do this exercise, and it's the complete opposite to that, which is actually why we struggle with it so much. Which is it's not a doctrine, and it's not a dogma. It says that it gives a principle, and so therefore Yin isn't necessarily cooling. That's a sort of Western way of trying to understand it and put it in a box, which is Yang is heating, Yin is cooling.
Yeah,
and it doesn't necessarily mean that. It's the balancing of the two energies, and somebody who's in sort of stone cold depression or heaviness or inertia needs warmth. And somebody who's overheating and spicy and hot and fiery needs cooling. So Yin yoga is not necessarily about, this is counteracting the fast-paced life, It's about finding the principles, the truths, and then applying them to each person specifically.
It's so interesting. I'm loving this. Because it's really, I mean, I don't know why I underestimated Yin yoga, because it's yoga, and yoga is a massive umbrella term. So it can really take you down so many different rabbit holes, which I love. And there was something that maybe my mind is forgetting. Maybe I'll come back to it if it pops into my head. So when did you first discover Yin, as we know it as consumers, on the timetable, categorized as?
I was actually working at a studio in London, which was purely at the time taught power practices. It was actually, in the title of the studio was Power. Sort of, it was just starting to creep into London, I think, the awareness of Yin yoga. And I'd obviously heard the word Yin because of the symbol, the Tai Chi 2, the black and white symbol with the white dot and the black dot, the circle.
Yeah.
Hard to do audio.
I think most people know that kind of yin yang.
You get a lot of teenagers' walls.
I was going to say, I used to have a T-shirt with it on. I thought it was really cool.
Exactly, it was very kind of 90s.
Oversized T-shirt.
Peace. Exactly. No one really knew what it meant, but it was kind of
unimportant. Tass. It looked good.
Exactly. Well, that symbol, in fact, within that symbol inhabits the principle of yin and yang, which is, for something to balance, there have to be two opposites reaching in opposite directions. And in the midpoint of those two things pulling in opposite directions is balance. And we know that from our vinyasa flow, our ashtanga practices, which is that if you're in a warrior 3, your fingertips must reach forwards, your toes must reach backwards in order for you to balance.
Yeah.
If one of those has more energy than the other, then you fall in either direction. And the same, so that is the principle of the physical balance, and then applying it to this idea of activity and passivity. And if one is pulling more so than the other, then we are going to experience imbalance ourselves, in our mental processes, in our spiritual fullness or emptiness or whatever it might be. So I was working at this studio that was a power studio, and they started to introduce Yin. And I, at this point, was feeling quite disillusioned with what was called power yoga. It felt like a factory.
Mm-hmm.
It was packed, very sweaty, very smelly,
Swampy.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that we have cleanliness as part of the 8 limbs of yoga, and so many people have never even, maybe have never even heard of the 8 limbs, or those are, and I don't see why things like that, cleanliness and truth and all that kind of thing, aren't as important as asana. But anyway, I was feeling fairly disillusioned with this power drive of yoga. I felt quite disillusioned with the people who were offering the teachings. I'd been in a spiritual tradition myself for, at the time, I think it was 14, 15 years. And what I was seeing displayed, or offered, should I say, as a teaching, in my understanding of spiritual practice, was not offering support to the people who were coming to receive the teaching. And then I spoke to a couple of teachers who were starting this new idea of or this new practice, not new, I mean, it's ancient, but in this studio in London and around London was new. And I went to a couple of the classes and thought, my goodness, this isn't much, this isn't kind of effort at all. I don't really know what this is all about. But I started to hear the Tao teachings being brought into the practices. And that's when the effort began. That's when the self-study that I had been taught in the disciplines that I had been practicing in started to enter into that room. And that was enough for me to go, this is what I want to teach. This is the vehicle I want to use. So that was when I realized that, that was going to be the right vehicle for me to pass on what had been given to me and had altered my life beyond recognition of what it used to be, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And just to backtrack a million minutes ago, not quite, but I was just thinking about this. You were saying in our culture, we struggle with, we have a way of thinking about things, and I think that might come from that kind of Christian, Judaic kind of black and white almost, heaven and hell, light and dark. And I think we still have that way of needing to categorize things, like this is how you're going to do this, and this is how you're going to do that. Yeah. And I think that could even be why Patanjali's sutras are so tantalizing for people, because it's very formulaic. If you follow these principles, it's formulaic if you read it from the way we have shaped our minds. I think there is yes. space in Patanjali Sutras to be read in the same way that the Tao is read. Agreed.
But I think language, we've cemented our language. So, I mean, for instance, when I'm sometimes working one-on-one with somebody, and I've been coached in a way with my teachers where they've turned to me and said, what's your motive behind that action? Is it a selfish motive? And because I have been coached in a way to not understand that word as offensive, just to understand it as, is this purely for self, or does it benefit more than just self? Rather than taking that as an offense, I'm able to reflect on it and go, actually, it's purely for self. And therefore, in the equation, what Patanjali is teaching is that if it's purely for self, there's going to be a karmic cost to that.
Which even then, it's not to say you're a bad person. It's just it's kind of cause and effect, isn't it?
Exactly. And I frequently, if you mention the word karma in a yoga class, yin or otherwise, always you'll have somebody coming up to you afterwards saying, with slight tongue in cheek, but always, in jest, there's always sort of seriousness, saying, I did this good turn and that means something good will happen to me, or I did something bad and therefore something bad's going to happen to me. And it's like, no. That's not the
very simplistic
at all. It's, it's like if you plant an apple seed, you're going to get an apple. If you plant an orange seed, you're going to get an orange. It's absolutely physics. And it's kind of, it removes morality, and all these spiritual traditions remove morality. And what the Zoroastrian and Judaic and Christian religions brought in was this concept of morality, this concept of heaven and hell, which then took us into this concrete thinking of, well, it either must be right or it must be wrong. I either must hate this person or I either must like this person. I either must do this path or I must do that path. And that is the complete opposite of, you need both opposites in order for something to balance. If you've got a sort of floppy piece of string and you pull it on one end, it's going, unless there's a counterforce to the other end, it crosses the room. For it to balance in space, it must be pulled equally from both sides, both heaven and hell, both light and dark, both black and white, both fire and ice. It has to, and so the two things which originated as the same thing, as spiritual practices to reconnect us to our homeostasis, to our balance, have now teach opposites. And that's why I think there's a huge movement back to spiritual practices such as yoga, such as meditation, whirling dervishes, or chanting, or whatever it might be. People are moving back to these teachings because the other one isn't truth. I'm sure you know as well as I do, you can buy one of these recipe books that says, eat in this way, and you will get such and such. And there's a sort of initial kind of ego-boosting moment of, I've managed 3 weeks of this amazing diet that's so restrictive I can't eat with my friends, and I have to check every single ingredient that goes into it. But the joy that doesn't last, that sense of accomplishment is not joy. It's not balance. And because there's no truth in it, it's unsustainable.
So it's really interesting. I think maybe this is why people are, like you're saying, finding things like yin yoga and moving more into meditation and looking at other texts and trying to rediscover what balance means to them on an individual level. Because whereas I think, I think there is a great truth. I don't know what the hell that is. But I think there is, there's a great logic to the universe. Yeah. But we also have our own eyes.
It says that truth is ever changing, but always the same.
Yeah. And I love that. The more and more I kind of read and listen to different information, things can be more than one thing at one time. You're a sum of parts. And I think
not only can it be more than one, it has to be for it to be sustainable. Because if one of those things takes over more so than any of the others, and it's not 2 points of balance, as we know from, multi-line postures. If you've got a leg and an arm and a next leg going out in a certain direction, all of those energetically have to equally go in that energy line.
Yeah, so you're not over-efforting in one specific place within the body.
Exactly, exactly.
Because that's where you get fatigue. I mean, I used to see it in my students. So if a student, say, was over-efforting in their arms and they were forgetting to use their legs, I know this is really simplistic, but I could see that they would fatigue much quicker than someone who was spreading the effort out globally in their body. And you could see more ease. And it was really interesting how you said you could take yin qualities anywhere. So if I was in the right state of mind, sometimes I'm not in the right state of mind, and I'd go to really, I would think, quite extreme hatha class. If I was in a yin state of mind, I would just flow through that crazy ass class and feel fine and just not be bothered by what other people are doing. I felt full of energy. I didn't feel as if I was going to die at the end. And there'd be other times where I would be so full of frustration, or I couldn't keep up and I was getting more and more agitated. And this was the same class. It's just that my attitude was the thing that was different. And I really like the idea of you can take that yin quality anywhere. I never really thought about it like that.
It's not prescriptive. That's the teaching. And people get frustrated with that. They want to come to you and they want a prescription, and the prescription, it has to be the same for everybody. And it's not. The Tao teaches that there is a universal truth, but that truth is ever changing, but always the same.
And also sorry to interrupt again, just really interested, but that's assuming that there's a level playing field, because we're all at our own stages, and what we need is different. So where there is one logical truth, but because we are embodying this life now, we're all at different. The way I can get to that truth will be different to the way you can get to that truth, just because of our history and our baggage and all those things.
Yeah, the word, the Tao, translates as the way or the path, and they say as many as there are people, there are Taos, there are paths.
And is this one of the reasons why so after you dabbled in the class, the YIN class at this power studio, and you obviously went and did a training. Who did you train with? Your first training?
I trained with Paul Grilly.
Yeah.
Who's sort of attributed, well, not sort of, he is attributed with really the spread of Yin Yoga. And the calling it of Yin Yoga. And his teachers, he kind of talks about three different people that he kind of were big influences to him. One of them being Paul Lee Zink, who was a 1970s martial artist, and he taught something called Taoist yoga, which, I don't think you're necessarily going to find that in any ancient texts. But it was a way in which, it was a vehicle for him to teach aspects of the Tao. So Paul Grilly, and then he also talks about his anatomy teacher, and then also Dr. Motoyama, who helped him understand the connection between the two, the Chinese energy system and the Indian energy system. And the interesting thing about this is that, that's also what Taoist yoga did, was kind of combining this idea of meridian lines, which is what we often hear about, talked about in acupuncture and Chinese medicine, and then the nadis, which we often hear about, talked about in Ayurveda and the yoga tradition, and how these two societies, cultures, had a similar way of describing an energy communication system in the body that affected overall health and balance and homeostasis. And yet, I always say in my classes, what's fascinating is these guys weren't emailing each other and faxing each other and ringing each other up to check, if they located. And so often we see, not more than so often, almost to the point of kind of magic, these links where certain organs have been linked with certain emotions, the lungs with grief, the liver with anger. Often in most spiritual practices, there's some concept of self-esteem in the core. And even Latin means the heart of self. And so we're talking about the organ, the heart, but the heart of self being, that central space. So many of these concepts are the same, and yet they weren't communicating with each other in order to ascertain that.
And was that all discovered via meditation, I suppose, people's own insight, divine channeling? I don't know how. I wonder how they managed it. Like you said, it's magic. It's pure magic that everyone was having these similar experiences, and then because of their culture and wherever they were in the world, they filtered it through that lens, and that's why we get these different terminologies. I often think that they probably, they had less distraction. So as soon as you get on a yoga mat and you go into a child's pose and you start to remove some of the distractions that draw you out of yourself, and as the world progresses and we've got more people and more technology and there's more and more things to draw us out of ourselves. So the listening to the self becomes less and less. And, the chakra system and certain sacred chants, people heard them within their body. That's how the stories go, is that the chants were heard as if they could hear the sound happening within their body.
And I'm sure, if we were to isolate ourselves in a cave or on a beach for any length of time, and it may be that somebody would attribute it to a hallucination from isolation or something, but I'm sure that, who's to say what's real and what's imagined?
Yeah.
That we would start to hear sounds, that we would start to feel sensations within the body, that we only have a certain amount of awareness possibility in our brain. There's the 7 plus or minus awareness. If I say to you now, what's your phone number? All of a sudden you can tell me your phone number, but you weren't thinking of it before I said that.
Mm.
So, that those pieces of awareness we can pull out of subconscious into our awareness. If that awareness is taken up with, people walking past us and the noise of traffic, or scrolling through the internet or watching television, then that awareness simply isn't going to be listening to, what's going on in the body. So that's my belief of where those descriptions came from. And they had very, what we now call wise men recording and testing that.
Yeah, and I think as well, we spend so much of our time, maybe now more than ever, in our kind of mundane thinking, like you said, the phone, the email, the TV, the to-do list. How am I going to get from A to B?
Sort of thinking, is it?
Yeah.
It's and kind of, if somebody says to you, step into your higher self, you don't see yourself kind of sitting in your tracksuit bottoms, slouched.
I don't know.
Flicking the thumb up as you scroll through Instagram, or down, or whatever it is. Which, is the picture most of us have but that, when somebody says to you, step into your higher self, that's not where you go.
No.
So even if you've never inhabited your higher self, you still know what it would look like.
Yeah. On some sort of instinctual level, or.
Yeah.
And I think as well, meditation, like when you said about, if someone goes away and isolates themselves and they might, have maybe it's cabin fever, or they go into this weird state of mind. In a way, that is what meditation does, take you into an altered state of mind. And I think, and I think maybe now it's fashionable, I don't know, to say that because it was an altered state of mind, that it's not real. Imagination isn't real. Whereas I actually think it's real.
Everything.
I think my imagination is real and it is valid, and I do need to pay attention to it. And it isn't just child's play. I mean, you couldn't be in the magical mindset all the time, or the spiritual mindset in that way all the time, because you wouldn't get anything done. But I do think there's an avoidance of our potential in that way, which I think is a real shame, of dropping into that higher self and listening, listening.
Being in higher self is a huge responsibility, and people are running from their responsibilities. And what I mean by running from their responsibilities, not necessarily, being a good parent or turning up for work on time, but people are running from the responsibility of self-care.
Absolutely. And I think there is a big movement at the minute of self-care. But it's kind of marketed in a certain way, and
people want to pigeonhole it. So, self-care is this 3 times a week, and self-care is this, and for some, that's the whole teaching of Yin Yoga, is it's not prescriptive. For some people, speaking up for themselves is going to be self-care. For some people, learning how not to assert, to be aggressive is going to be self-care. Now, those two actions from the outside look like the same thing, but that's why we can't really teach, a sequence or a certain asana or a certain drink or a certain food as self-care, because within each person, then there needs to be a rebalancing. Now, one person might be, their energy might be pulling too far forwards. Another person, their energy is pulling too far back. So you simply, and that's where it becomes from religion with a baby R, which is these original spiritual practices, to a religion with a capital R, where we are creating gurus, with a capital G. when actually guru, remover of darkness, means anything that takes you out of the thought that you have believed into a new way of thinking that you weren't thinking previously.
Oh, love it. And when you were saying about the it's so exciting. And when you were saying about the pull in opposition, and it just made me think, and different energies, it did make me think of the Rajas and Sattva and
it's the same story. It's the same story.
Just
which is
different
those
words.
Are qualities. You know, we can attribute those things to foodstuffs or activities or pranayama or, you know, whatever it might be, and they are only that in relation to something else.
Exactly. It's beyond fascinating how we've managed to turn this quite open-ended technique, method, lineage of simply just self-discovery, learning about the self, and try and railroad it into do this, you get that, and it to be a universal truth where, you know, like there was a conversation, I wrote a blog about it. There was a conversation on Facebook about food and about veganism, and I'm really interested to listen, and people have their different opinions, and open dialogue is awesome. But then there was some people that just wanted to win out on the other of like, no, this is the yogic diet. And this other person's like, no, this is the yogic diet. And I just thought, it's bollocks. Because what I need is different to what you need.
That people want something concrete.
Yeah,
because
it's easier.
In something concrete, they exist.
And also it takes away your own responsibility and your own. If you just blindly follow something because your teachers said this is so, and you blindly follow it, it's easier because you don't have to question your motives. You don't have to question where it's coming from, and you don't even have to think, do I personally agree with it? Because it's easier to just follow.
I would even go a step further with that, which is, the reason that I can talk about this stuff so passionately is because I was such a lost individual as a child. You know, I completely lost a sense of self through somebody else claiming that sense of self for their own egoic purposes. And so I was somebody that, I was always a questioner, but from the outside, it might look like I was blindly following. But actually, I could justify to the end of the earth why you had to eat like this and why you should do this and why that. But, you know, we seek what affirms our beliefs, because if I wasn't to seek information that confirmed I was right, I'd be wrong. Yeah. And to be wrong is, you know, it's like kind of, well, if I'm wrong, everything I know is you've pulled the rug from underneath me.
Yeah. And that's the scariest thing, right? It's that freedom. It's almost that freedom within. It's just too open-ended. Like you said, if you pull up one string, one thread, it all unravels. And then what are you left with?
That's the same process that happened with religion. They started off as means of connecting ourselves back to the spiritual, back to a sense of a higher power, whether that's feeling of a higher self or whether it's a deity or whatever it might be. And that's a baby R. It was a Latin word meaning to reconnect. Ligio means ligament. Reconnect back to that sense of wonder and higher self, you know, that's not the person sitting in the tracksuit bottom slouch kind of scrolling through Instagram, but into that kind of loving, radiant person. And then we end up with these things that are capital R religions that are at war with one another, telling each other, I'm right, you're wrong. This is how you should eat. This is how you should dress. This is what you should do on a Friday evening. This is what you should do on a Sunday morning. You know, it kind of the same process that happened with yoga and these spiritual teachings and the Tao, that now people are trying to, not so much with the Tao because it's not so popular or well known, but, you know, there's no, it's the Ashtanga system's the right way. No, you should do more restorative. No, you should drink green juices. No, you should be vegan. And it's exactly the same process.
And to me, the practice of any of this, any spiritual technique that isn't bound by dogma, is to unravel, is to pull. It is kind of you are pulling your own rug from underneath you. You know, there's
no
yeah.
freer place to be than being wrong.
And you know what? And as soon as you can go, yeah, I really balls that up, or okay, how can I do that better?
Well, not even a balling up of it, but like, you know, the way. So, you know, if you're somebody that has always thought that this is the way to do things, you must always be on time, you must always be perfect, you must always keep your health in check, you must always, and then to go, oh, hold on, maybe there's another way of thinking about this.
Because I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt all the time, Tass. I'm interrupting you all the time. Because keep going.
We've barely even touched on yin yoga. We're 40 minutes in.
I just it's
100
awesome.
hours.
This might be a two-parter.
Yeah.
No, but
Let's go back to the script.
Never. No, I warned you. I was like, I barely keep. I'm not strict with myself because I'm like, if it goes somewhere I think is interesting, that's where we're going to go.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a completely selfish project because this is the way I can learn from people.
But going back to, you're offering it as a learning tool for other people.
Yeah,
so
I know, yeah. And hopefully it's like, it's good for me, therefore it's good for others. That's kind of the hope.
Yeah.
It's kind of the hope.
Let's
So I
share the knowledge.
I will get back. Shall I get back on it? So you did the training and
so I trained with
yeah.
at a Buddhist monastery, which was an extraordinary experience, and I went with a friend of mine, and it was, you know, we definitely, I mean, I got, again, it's that sort of thing of like what's imagined and what's reality, but I definitely had a sort of purifying experience in the sense that I got a fever, and
oh wow,
I remember that I was kind of stuck in bed, and my friend who I was sharing this monastic room with, in this damp kind of redwood forest, and redwood trees are meant to sort of, they're said to bring out sort of all kinds of crazy thoughts from your brain or whatever. And she came in, and I said, in that sort of feverish state, I said, "Don't take your hairbrush back. I'm brushing the pig." You know, obviously,
oh dear.
All this stuff was coming out from being in this retreat, in this place. But yeah, no, it was an incredible experience. And Paul is an incredibly well-read, educated man. I mean, it took me to a different place of understanding, because my understanding before I went on the training was I hadn't really thought about this idea of yoga being a vehicle for teaching spiritual concepts, rather than it being a way to just inhabit the body physically and connect the mind and the body.
So it kind of it just sounds like there was a major evolution and development of your own spiritual practice.
Yeah. I I mean, strangely enough, when I came back from California, we were there. I think we were there for about, I can't remember. It feels like a month now, which is quite a long time to be somewhere. You know, to kind of give up your work schedule. And I came back to the UK, you know, and I think I was meant to be teaching the following morning or something. And I obviously kept my commitments that I had but I found that for the following 6 months, I didn't want to teach. I didn't want to kind of participate. I mean, one of the things that was kind of really mind-blowing being there was that we explored a lot of the sort of cliches that come out of teachers' mouths, you know, about alignment, and you should do it this way and you should do it that way. And as I say, there's no freer place to be than wrong, you know. And there was definitely that sort of question of like, have I been exacerbating these falsehoods? You know, have I been teaching people that if you do it this way, this will happen? Because if I have, then I'm participating in turning that very open-ended spiritual practice with the, you know, sort of baby R as religion, as the way I was describing religions happened. Am I participating in turning that into a doctrine? And if so, you know, what's motivating that? Is it my own fear of, you know, not being free myself? It was a pivotal training for me, both in the sense of how deep he went in terms of anatomy, and how to view the body anatomically, you know, to make it a functional practice rather than an aesthetic practice. Yes,
I think
I have no idea where I'm going.
No, I was getting you.
I'm now in my room in my feverish state with the redwoods surrounding me.
Come back. You're okay. You're comfortable. You're warm.
Yes,
so it just made me think again. It's that this need for us to boil this huge thing into something simple, and I suppose maybe it is in essence simple, but we're not. This need to bring your knee over the ankle, and any alternative will cause damage here. Or this pose, your pelvis should be here in Trikonasana, because otherwise your spine might snap. And and I think for me, I had very similar experience before I came to New Zealand. I completely lost the love of teaching because I felt in my own practice as I was developing, I was coming to these sorts of thinkings of, you know, I don't want to teach like this. I don't practice this way. How can I teach this thing when I don't even practice it myself? But then being pulled and studios telling you, but if you do it like this, we get more people. And it totally, I needed that time off. So we moved here, and I haven't taught. I taught a bit at the beginning of my time in New Zealand, but I really just needed, I think, in hindsight, even though I desperately miss class and I miss teaching, but I think it's forced me to look more deeper of what is it that I'm practicing, what is it that I want to teach, and how do I want to teach it? And exactly what you said, am I just making noise? Am I just adding to this sort of distraction, yoga becoming a religion with a capital R, you know, like am I getting involved in that? And that's not something I want to get involved in. So it's really interesting how you said that because of this. I mean, it sounds like you were having these discoveries prior to the training and the YIN, but then it was that catalyst that kind of it was the unraveling of what you were doing prior to what you wanted to do. So when you took that time off, if you did, or you slowed it down a bit,
definitely a time off.
You did, okay. And then when you started to teach the YIN, so you got your first class, I don't know. Did you just go in and think, I'm going to teach what I think people want from me, or I'm going to teach a bit of this and a bit of slyly add some of this Taoist stuff in. How did you go about teaching when you first started?
I'm trying to remember now what my first sort of public class was.
It's all a blur.
It was a definite. So we kind of in the intro went into how I came to yoga, and as I say, I spent many years before I even attempted any kind of movement with my body, doing mindfulness, meditation, trauma recovery work in the body. So, I mean, that might from the outside look like something yoga asana-ish, which was, where are your feet? Can you feel your feet on the ground? Can you lift your right knee up towards your chest? Which was nothing to do with strengthening, the right oblique or lengthening the left hip flexor or whatever it was. It was simply about, can you move your awareness around your body without having a panic attack?
Yeah.
And through those teachings, I call them teachings, which makes them sound sort of special and spiritual, but it was really therapy, and it was, what is teaching? Is someone showing you how to bake a cake teaching? Yes, to some extent it is, and that's what we do in yoga, is we teach the knowledge we have currently at the time, and my goodness, has my knowledge changed. So, there's a danger of that word. We have very big words in yoga. We say we're practicing yoga and we're teaching yoga, and there's a sort of it can be a sort of forced importance. But those things that I was learning, shall I say, before I came to any kind of yoga movement, were things that I wanted to offer to other people. Now, whether I'm an expert teacher of them or not, I don't know, and it doesn't sort of matter to me. But if I can communicate to somebody a technique that may free them from a pattern of thinking, then that is fulfilling to me. And so when I went to do my trial for the studio to teach a regular YIN class in a studio, that was what I wanted to deliver. And I was trialed by the studio owners, and the two of them came, it was the three of us in this enormous yoga studio with
I know the one
phone ringing reception and, the fire alarm going in the office next door and all the kind of distractions that could possibly happen. But as I was choosing the postures to move the body into, which obviously had physical benefits that would elicit sensations within the body, I chose to deliver the information that had been delivered to me the many years previous about what sensation could help us see from the physical principles of atoms moving in the body, and how we could translate that to help us understand the movement of thoughts, the movement of emotion, and how we attach to emotion or detach from emotion. So that was my way. And if I wasn't going to be able to teach that, then it would have been better for the studio owners, they really enjoyed the parallels that I was drawing and offered me a class. And that was when I started teaching on a regular basis YIN. Had they not related to that, it would have been better that they had said, we don't think you're the right person to teach here. Because if I had been then teaching, a regular class for how many years it was before I moved out of London, where I was simply just, running through the 16 poses of YIN and their variations and offshoots, and kind of, making up bits and pieces here and there, that would have not been fulfilling to me. And as you well know, Rachel Perry, yoga is not something you do as a monetary, it's not financially rewarding. So it's got to be
that the truth.
Other way. And we were talking before the interview, and you were talking about the Tantra text you're reading, and you read a principle or a concept and you get a fire in your belly.
Yeah.
And when I teach, or when again, I hesitate over when I teach, when I preach, when I offer information that was offered to me and has made significant and powerful or had significant and powerful impact in my life, and I offer that to somebody else, I get that feeling in my belly, where I'm fulfilled, where I feel like I'm standing in my light, where I feel like I'm, for lack of a better word, my dharma, my purpose.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Oh, that's so beautiful. I am tearing up a bit.
Oh,
yeah, I just.
God, I feel like I'm absolutely talking nonsense. I mean, not nonsense, but I feel like I can't communicate it to the world.
No, you're doing beautifully, really. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so with I've noticed that you're still practicing what we call, yang yoga as well as yin. And
Yeah.
do you still compartmentalize in your own practice? Do you have like, I'm going to do a yang practice today, or today I'm going to do yin?
Absolutely not. Yeah,
no,
so. Not at all. I mean, I very rarely. If I'm in London, I will go to a studio and I will look on the schedule, and depending on what, and it's simply a question of timing. At 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening, this I really enjoy that teacher's insight. I have a friend, actually the same friend that I did the training with in California, and she's now gone off to do a degree in acupuncture, and so I really enjoy going to her classes because I get to learn more intricacy about the meridian lines. Her anatomy is very strong, so it often takes me into anatomical thinking about inner workings of the body. If I'm in London and it's Tuesday morning and if the time fits with my schedule, then I will go over to a class that is very dynamic, but incredibly interesting movement. Somebody who incorporates mudras and, so absolutely, I don't think to myself, I need a bit of yin or I need a bit of yang, because as I said to you, my understanding of those concepts has completely changed in that there isn't anything that is yin or anything that is yang. Everything is in relation to something else. So within my practice, I mean, for instance, if I'm doing 20 minutes of a morning before I go off to teach a movement class, an asana class, and I'm thinking about toe tapping, that's quite hard to describe audibly, but hands down in sort of hands down position with shoulders stacked over wrists, and I'm looking to shorten my hip flexors and my core in order to get my hips up so that my toes start to creep up my arms, with the purpose of hopefully pressing to a handstand, because the yin, the downward energy of the arms, the push you have to have into the ground in order to create that lift, again, is this principle of if yin and yang are not in the same space, then
nothing will
lost
happen.
Nothing happens.
So at that point, that's really so. In relation to the other, because the arms are down and the action that they're doing, that would, in essence, make them the yin aspect of that.
Yeah, and that's
movement.
How I think about my practice now is where is the yin aspect of this?
Ooh, and is the face always yin? Should it always be yin?
The face of the.
It's just your face. You know when you see people when you're teaching. I'm saying this lovingly, but like they can look really, really upset.
Yeah.
You say like soften the jaw, be in the jaw. Could you say that?
The face. That's difficult. I wasn't prepared for that.
That's it. Now you've got to look into the face. Like, what does the face have to do?
Yeah, well, the face is an interesting one. It's actually with the first place that people, because when you say to people your life is having an effect on your body, there's a kind of wishy-washy, of course it is, and da-da. But then, we look at the wrinkles on our face as we get older and where the eyes crease or between the eyes. And that is repetitive movement of the skin and the fascia.
Yeah.
That's creating it's like crumpling up a shirt and leaving it on the floor. And when you take it out, there's lines in it.
Yeah.
And that's, if you're holding your face in certain patterns, you will show that on the outside. And the same is happening spiritually. If you are holding your spirit in a certain holding pattern, whether it's because your nervous system's activated, so your shoulders are caved in and you're fearful and there's a kind of condensing around the heart, that shows in our expression.
Yeah.
So the face is actually a really useful one to point that out to people, because they're like, oh yeah, I do have wrinkles where I've held that facial pattern.
Yeah.
And if I do body, and if I do it in my life, and if I do it, off the mat, that's gonna be my expression.
It's that cause and effect thing again, that principle of, you do this action, this is the likely outcome. And if you keep repeating the action, then you're definitely gonna have the outcome. More wrinkles. Yeah. So going back to almost the bare bones of the YIN practice. So whenever I've participated in a YIN class in a studio, the teachers often, they might talk a little bit about, philosophy or the nervous system, but there's a lot of talk about ligaments and this sort of work. And for me, I'm not a contortionist, but I'm pretty flexible because of my dance background. And so I've always been able to do the splits, and I've always been able to touch my toes. I've got really flexible hamstrings. And so I would always, my own bias, I'm not saying I'm right at all, but I would have this inner resistance to it, and I would sometimes hold back because I was worried that I don't want to get too flexible. I want to be strong. So I wondered what you think about that.
Well, I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, because quite often it's the other way around. As people will come to me and say, particularly men, actually, they'll say, "Oh, I can't do yoga. I can't touch my toes. I'm not flexible." And it's like, why are we focusing on flexibility? We're looking for equal flexibility and strength, both within the body, because if we're too flexible, then, we've got nothing supporting the structure and we're just a sort of floppy mess. If we're overly strong, we become rigid, and that's when fascia starts to tighten up and we start to change the shape of the structure. And equally, you take that concept off the mat, somebody who's overly flexible to other people's plans and other people's needs and other people's wants, becomes a doormat.
Yeah.
And somebody who's overly strong in their relationship to their environment becomes sort of rigid and fixed and inflexible, not being able to accommodate
or adapt
any moving around them. So again, we go back to this idea that nothing in and of itself is yin and yang. Nothing in and of itself is strong and flexible. It's only in relation to other things that those qualities come about. So in terms of the yoga practice, whether it's yin or yang, and looking for strength or flexibility, in all things we want to look for that balance point between the two energies, or three energies, or four energies, or five energies going in different directions. In terms of the physical, my knowledge currently comes from Paul Grilly, that's the person that I have learned this physical discipline under. And he would say that being overly flexible is not a concern. If somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm hypermobile in my elbows or my knees," or whatever it is, your joints can go to that range of motion, and therefore you should allow them to go to that range of motion, that you're not going to do any damage. It would be different if we were doing rhythmic movements with that level of flexibility, because then you've got the added bounce at the end of your range of motion. when you're working against gravity, for instance. So say you're doing Paschimottanasana, and there's in a rhythmic 5-breath practice, the likelihood is that you're going to jump to it and lift up and fold forward, and there's going to be a bounce at the end of your range of motion. But in yin yoga, you're placing yourself into it. The idea is to soften the muscles around it. So, muscles are only going to lengthen if they're active. If they're soft, they're only going to go to their full range of motion anyway.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, you can do the experiments. I mean, again, it's very hard to do without being visual, but you can do that experiment, with your finger. If you flex your finger so the muscles are active in your finger, and you try and pull your finger, you can feel there's a sort of stretch to the muscle fibers and very, very little movement in the joint. Yeah. Whereas if you let your finger go kind of soft and floppy and you give it a little pull, the muscles are no longer determining the structure of the bone. So there's a little bit of movement within the joint. And because of the sort of the pace that again, air quotes, what we might call yin yoga poses are done, there's a lot that you've got a lot more time to be aware of anything that feels injurious. Sure, yeah. So you can immediately pull back. Whereas, again, if you're moving through a dynamic practice, once you've hit that bounce point at the end of your range of motion, you've already gone too far. That's when the injury's already happened. Yeah. Paul doesn't entertain this idea of hypermobility and the possibility of injury through being overly flexible in a yin practice. And he very much specifies, with the intention of being very present and not rushing through movement and exploring, your edge, so to speak.
So folks, that's part 1 complete, and part 2 will be winging its way to you soon. So if you want to find out more about Tass, you can go to her website, which is allthewsalignedwith.com, and there you'll find out more about the lovely Tass and also links to her social media platforms. And if you want to find out more about this particular episode, you can go to the show notes page on my website, which is allthews.rachelperry.co.nz. So until next time, happy practicing and happy teaching.